Don't lies eventually lead to truth? And don't all my stories, true or false, tend toward the same conclusion? Don't they all have the same meaning? So what does it matter whether they are true or false, if in both cases they are significant of what I have been and what I am? Sometimes it is easier to see clearly into the liar than into the man who tells the truth. Truth, like light, blinds. Falsehood, on the contrary, is a beautiful twilight that enhances every object. Hi everyone, and welcome to Attention. Today we'll be returning to Albert Camus, someone very well known for his obvious optimistic outlook on absolutely everything. Did we read the same novel? Yeah, we had to have. Now, I have discussed Camus in the past. We did a little series on The Stranger, where we went over a lot of the more philosophical concepts that are found throughout his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. And I will have a playlist provided in the description below. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. But today we'll be discussing the short novel The Fall, which would be the last book he would publish in his lifetime, though he would have many works published posthumously, such as the novel The First Man. The Fall would inevitably be the last novel that he himself saw published. And with that, we'll just jump right in. Published in its original French in 1956 and a year later in English, The Fall reads as a confessional novel told through a series of monologues by the narrator, Jean-Baptiste Clamence. In short, Clamence speaks to a stranger in a tavern located in Amsterdam, which is absolute hell, literally, metaphorically. Speaking of his successes as a highly respected defense lawyer in Paris, which represents heaven. A lot has been discussed on these locations, so I won't get too much into it here, but I will provide some essays that I may be able to find that do get into it if you're interested. Subsequently, the monologues unfold as a confession. As Clamence continues to speak, he eventually starts to tell specific events that leads to what he would consider his downfall, which is why he's at this bar called Mexico City in Amsterdam. A short novel that explores themes typical to that of his previous work. Themes of innocence, truth, existence and non-existence, and imprisonment. And of course suicide, as this is Camus. And as we come to find out, Clamence thinks of himself, or at least did think of himself, as a well-respected moral individual whose cases as a defense lawyer revolved around those in need, such as widows and orphans. He'd be the one who's friendly to strangers and would make a point of it, living for the sake of others, claiming virtue as its own reward. He held a very high social status and lived a life that would bring happiness. However, with all of this going accordingly, he does fall from this height. Kind of reminds me of Don Draper, although I've never seen the show, so I don't know why. As stated, he kind of sees Amsterdam as this bourgeois hell and calls it a judge penitent, a place where one will confess their own sins while simultaneously condemning you for yours. There are a few incidences that bring him to Amsterdam, all which seem to be repressed memories, which would slowly be recalled to him after one night crossing a bridge in Paris. He hears laughter come from somewhere around him. Now, of course, he looks around and he can't locate exactly where this laughter's coming from and has no reason to believe that it is directed to him in any sort of way. In fact, he even claims it sounded somewhat playful. Which, of course, cheerful laughter when crossing a bridge in the middle of the night that seems to come out of nowhere couldn't possibly mean, get out of there. But the more he thinks about it, the more this laughter begins to bother him. It quickly becomes a laughter in which he directs towards his hypocrisy. As these memories arise, he begins to see the hypocrisy in what he's been doing this whole time, in regard to his career and what he believed what he was doing for noble causes. The laughter began to seem more cynical, as if mocking who Clamence truly was. He would begin to remember certain things he would do, such as he would recall tipping his hat to a blind man, as only to be seen by others as committing a good deed, while these things were done only to improve his own self-esteem. He would have made a great politician, as terrible people make good politicians. Little by little, since the first day he heard the laughter, he would realize more and more his hypocrisy. He would come to the conclusion that he was only living for himself under the guise of helping others. Some of these memories would have had a much bigger impact on him. He recalls a traffic accident, one that is seemingly not too serious, but leads to a fight in the streets regardless. An incident that wouldn't set the average person down a spiral, but one that should be typically brushed off. However, Clamence does not do this. He lets his humiliation get to him and begins to carry with him this deep feeling of shame. This incident had shattered an image that he previously held of himself. And yet it was one in which he does admit was soon forgotten by everyone who witnessed it. This mention of others that had witnessed it forgetting it quickly is very key to the way Clamence is thinking about this. The judgment that he's most concerned with is not the judgment brought on by others. It is simply a judgment that comes deep within himself. As he continues to speak to the stranger at the bar, he reveals more and more of how he found himself to be a complete fraud. He eventually reveals the memory which he calls his essential discovery. One night in November, 2 or 3 years before he first heard the laughter, he remembers walking across that very bridge. He happens to faintly see a woman all in black leaning over the edge. However, he ignores this and continues to walk, and soon after he hears a splash, accompanied with a few yells from the passing river below, before all goes silent. He stops for a short moment, but doesn't look behind him, and soon after continues his walk. He concludes that the woman that he did see must have committed suicide, but he also believed that there was nothing he could do about it. However, here too we are given another key in the way Clamence is thinking about these things. Though he states that there was nothing he could do about it, he does state that the cries of the woman after she had fallen were several. A bit ambiguous and leaves open an undetermined time frame. And not only that, but when he speaks to the stranger does ask about the incident, to which he says he doesn't know as he didn't look at the papers the following day. So it's more than he didn't just think there was nothing he could do, he simply just didn't care. Or at least didn't care enough to do anything about it. However, here he doesn't do so much as to call for help. Something that would have been more of a natural instinct to anyone else in that situation, regardless of if it would result in saving the woman's life or not. This leaves the reader to question if there were people around to witness this suicide. Would Clamence have then done something to appear as a hero? Now here we're presented with a very clear picture on who Clamence is, but why exactly is he telling the stranger all of this? He was paying for drinks the whole night. And what is it that Albert Camus is getting at in this novel? Confess your sins before you drink. Clamence is constantly judging primarily himself, claiming he originally thought he was innocent while in Paris, but believes this was a lie and that he is guilty of being a fraud. Someone who seeks the approval of others for very selfish interests, simply helping those in need for the gratification it would lend him. As once again shown by politicians, all that he thought he was doing in good nature was indeed done in self-interest. And what this all comes down to is a simple gesture, not to himself, but the stranger, or better yet, the reader, who he does seem to truly be speaking to, or at least what Albert Camus was trying to get at, using Clamence more as a mirror. As Clamence continues to speak about the reasons on why he was doing this, one can't help but think where they themselves do the exact same thing. Here one can begin to see a kind of Kantian deontology, which claims that regardless intended or actual consequences, the only way to properly assess morality is to look at the motive of the action. Moral behavior should be driven by a sense of duty rather than that of desire. Now, this, of course, isn't to say that Clamence held a categorical imperative as rule, or at least there's no intention other than this one similarity. And though I'm sure there could be some arguments made, that's not what I'm trying to say here. Of course, Kant would also say that one is never in a position to know all the motivations one has for doing anything. And in this case, one could then make the argument that Clamence is judging himself too harshly. I mean, depending on one's own ethics, the case or act utilitarian may still be able to make an argument that Clamence is still an upright individual. But they probably wouldn't, as it would greatly decrease the happiness of everyone that has to listen to the argument. However, the point is, if Clamence, a man who dedicated himself to helping those in need by law, a man that was admired within the social circles he communicated with, a man by all accounts from an outside appearance another would look up to, if he is guilty, then by what chance does anyone have of being innocent? What is the reader supposed to grasp from this other than a reflection of who it is they are or who we are? It is one thing to have the constant stress of having others judge you, but what Clamence shows is even if you were to get rid of all of that, you can't escape the judgment you would put on yourself if you truly were to take a look at yourself. And what it comes down to is a reflection of consciousness. Clamence essentially questions the role of consciousness as a thing that is even desirable. On the contrary, consciousness is more a curse bestowed upon being who is condemned to be free. And quick note here, as I'm sure this will come up in the comments eventually. In the October of 1951, Camus published his famous essay, The Rebel, in which he expounds on his judgment of freedom. He states that every human is free, but freedom itself is relative. We have to embrace our limits and calculated risks, saying that absolutes are necessarily anti-human. Now, this is contrary to Sartre, who I just quoted there. And though it makes sense in context, I'm by no means saying that Sartre and Camus agreed upon the limits of freedom and what its implications are. Clamence becomes an example of the Aristotelian tragic hero, one who possesses what is considered heroic qualities, but whose prosperity shifts due to tragic flaw. This, in Clamence's case, would be his own consciousness. The attempt to know himself puts him in the position to judge himself, and in doing so, manipulates the reader into doing the same. What Albert Camus does with The Fall is he takes the very well-known quote of Socrates, that being the unexamined life is not worth living, but then examines that statement itself, and concludes, is the examined life worth living at all? I hope you enjoyed that video. I know I did things a little different this time. I thought I'd kind of experiment a bit, and hopefully it didn't come off as too interruptive, but I am trying to think of ways I can make these a bit more entertaining. But if this way of doing it isn't something that anyone cares for, then be sure to let me know in the comments, and I can just continue doing it with the way I have been, or try something else. In any case, I hope you did get something from that, and if you have anything more to add on the fall, as there are so many more topics and subjects that we could have gone down, be sure to continue the conversation in the comments below, and I look forward to reading those. And until next time.